The Wayward Realms is a clear spiritual successor to Daggerfall, and the one game since the release of Daggerfall that is intentionally trying to capture the game design philosophy of the now nearly 30 years old Elder Scrolls title. And that's no coincidence. It's being directed by former Daggerfall creators Ted Peterson and Julian LaFay, under the new development team Once Lost Games. The Wayward Realms aims to try to capture the same sandbox RPG game design structure that makes Daggerfall, all of these years later, still one of the best games to roleplay in. The Wayward Realms will have a huge map of about 100 islands or so called the Archipelago, filled with vying factions and generational political struggles. A world, similarly to Daggerfall's, that includes all sorts of fantasy races like elves and dwarves, and both magical and supernatural locations of varying degrees of power hidden amongst this dynamic and constantly changing world. And the developers are calling this subgenre the Grand RPG. This is meant to reflect the enormous world that we'll be seeing in this game, combined with its focus on complex faction dynamics, all wrapped around a foundation of role-playing focused freedom. On their Kickstarter page, they break down their 4 core game pillars. I was particularly interested in their description of their role-playing pillar. It reads, "While other RPGs railroad their players into specific roles, the Wayward Realm lets the players decide what type of character they wish to play, who they would side with, and what actions that character would actually perform. For this reason, we have chosen to forego a traditional main quest in order to craft many smaller and more varied narratives for our factions, which will appeal to a broad swath of character types. The player can further shape their story by how they choose to deal with major world events. They could take part and influence the outcome, or simply stand by and live with whatever consequences these events bring to the world. Finally, our virtual game master will take a character's playstyle and tailor the quest, encounters, and rewards around them, much like a real-life tabletop game master." There is a sense to me, in this description by the team here, that the world exists outside of the player. The player, though likely can become powerful or influential, is not railroaded into being some vehicle of fate whose will determines the path of this world. Instead, what the developers wrote here implies that major events will unfold with or without your input, and so you have the role-playing freedom to dictate how much of an impact you will or will not have on these events. And with that in mind, I want to talk more about role-playing freedom and how I view it in the context of game design. It seems to me that many people like to use freedom a lot when describing RPG game design, but my explanation here of the role-playing focused freedom that we see in Daggerfall is not meant to reflect necessarily player choice like we might see in games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Dragon Age Origins. These games are not role-playing sandbox RPGs like Daggerfall. In those games, our decisions are generally born from the main quest or side quests that create branching paths of many different potential outcomes, often having some degree of influence on each other and taking into account past decisions, and so therefore creating freedom-driven consequences, but still forcing a curated narrative context for the characters and the player. But role-playing freedom, meaning the ability to create a character in class fantasy and set your own goals for a playthrough, is not brought about through the direction of the main quest. The character is not revealed through structured narrative moments. Instead, through being able to set a character's goals for ourselves, we build our own emergent story and endgame state. The player controls if and when the character has completed the game and its purpose in a playthrough. Having a solid foundation of role-playing systems that allow the player to take advantage of their character fantasy in a world will provide more potential role-playing angles and more role-playing creativity. But, perhaps most importantly, allowing for player-controlled distance from any sort of curated or structured main quest or narrative is central to sandbox role-playing. If the original Daggerfall team did not trust the player to be able to ditch the main story and still enjoy the game through building their own adventures and goals, then it would have not provided a sandbox role-playing experience. This is a core and intentional design aspect of Daggerfall. This doesn't mean that there can't be a main narrative or side quests that provide narratives. Daggerfall has both of those, and in some ways I wish it had more side quest narrative content. It's more about how narrative content is incorporated into the game's overall design, and what degree of mandatory content the game tries to force upon a player to progress, and in doing so, pulling away from the player their ability to navigate the world in a way that fits the role-playing fantasy that they are trying to create. Fundamental to capturing Daggerfall's sandbox role-playing success is to understand role-playing freedom, and I have high hopes that both Ted and Julian still share that same passion for sandbox roleplaying that I and many others like me that love Daggerfall still have. It's really exciting to imagine how much time both Ted and Julian have had since Daggerfall's release to build upon the original vision for the game. What types of additions will they be making that they wish they could have included in Daggerfall, from either a lack of imagining it at the time or from technological limitations of the mid-90s? I've tried to give a lot of thought to what kinds of new content would fit well into the Daggerfall game design philosophy. The Daggerfall Unity modding community has already given us a glimpse of what some of those changes might look like by allowing talented mod authors to greatly expand the role-playing experience and foundation of Daggerfall. Can we expect more narrative-focused side quest content, similar to the kinds of side quests in Morrowind or later Elder Scroll titles? Or maybe using a similar skill system to Daggerfall's, but also introducing more non-combat skills to help define the qualities of the character that we're role-playing, skills like fishing, hunting, or crafting. It could be interesting to have a non-combat skill like fishing contributing to a character's leveling. Or maybe we'll have the ability to open our own shops or our own temples in this world if we want to be a trader, a smith, a religious leader, or underground Daedric worshipping cult. Are these even additions that Daggerfall fans would actually want to see in a spiritual successor? Or do these lean too heavily into the sim genre of gaming? There's a lot that the Wayward Realms team is going to need to consider when approaching additions like these to a Daggerfall spiritual successor. Developing an interesting history and interesting lore for this world will be key to selling the player an immersive land to roleplay in. One of the aspects of Daggerfall that I always loved even from the very first time I played it is the way you choose your character. The game doesn't just hand you a list of races and their racial benefits and say, choose one. Instead, you're shown the world map, with the major regions separated and labeled. Clicking on any region provides a small explanation of both the physical characteristics and cultural characteristics of the race that hails from that specific region. And in doing so, the 1996 Daggerfall team already begins the process of selling this world to the player and activating the player's imagination. Does this region that borders this other one have a history of conflict, or were they historically blood brothers in the past? Maybe a mix of both depending on which years in their history you look at. Will being a race from a foreign land to the Iliac Bay, like the Argonian or Khajiit, give me the player a harder time throughout High Rock or Hammerfell? These are all parts of subtle and good world building. Without any concrete explanation of Tamriel's history or lore, I was already interested in both, and so ready to be introduced to more explicitly described historical events, like the ones we might see in lore books or introduced to us through character conversations. One way that the Wayward Realms is already trying to develop this is by releasing on their website the Library of Lore, a small collection of lost lore and stories from the world made available to anyone curious. I recommend 23 Years by the Sword for a bit of dwarven history and The Horseman for an interesting look at the development team's style of character writing. These types of lost stories or slices of history have a writing cadence that is similar to the books you can find and read throughout Daggerfall. Small windows into various topics of the world's history and lore. I really like the idea of providing these stories to the player before the game is released, and allowing us to develop a sense of the type of world we will hopefully be finding ourselves deeply immersed in. The Wayward Realms is my most anticipated future release. It represents a chance to recapture something I found for the first time in Daggerfall, a game that deeply understood the potential of sandbox role-playing games. From what I've read from the team over at Once Lost Games, I find myself seriously surprised at how much their game design philosophy matches the game experiences that I am passionate about and value. I recommend everyone giving their Kickstarter page a read to understand further the core principles that govern their game design. One of my hopes for the Wayward Realms is that it injects into the gaming industry a new appreciation for sandbox RPGs. I hope it inspires other studios to engage with the idea of reducing the amount of hyper-curated narrative content that they so often give to players in RPG games. I'm very optimistic about the Wayward Realms, and I plan to cover it on this channel after its full release, so I hope you'll all look forward to that. Please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if this is your first time hearing about the Wayward Realms, or if this is a game that you were already excited for. And for all my fellow Daggerfall fans watching, I'd love to hear what additions you're hoping to see in the Wayward Realms. If you enjoyed watching this, please consider supporting me by subscribing to my channel or to my Patreon through the link in the video description below. Thanks for watching. I appreciate everyone that tunes into my videos, and I hope I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.